It was a winter morning in 1944, somewhere along the frozen fields of Belgium. A German sergeant, his uniform torn and blackened by smoke, stumbled out of a tree line with his hands raised above his head. Behind him, the remnants of his company lay scattered across a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Craters from American artillery shells pockmarked the earth in every direction. Burned-out vehicles still smouldered in the grey light. The sergeant had survived the Battle of the Bulge, but barely. As American soldiers surrounded him and began the process of taking him prisoner, he muttered something in broken English that his captors would hear repeated hundreds of times over the coming months. Something about the shells, something about the sky, something that every German prisoner seemed compelled to say. What the Americans did not know was that this sergeant would soon find himself at a secret facility on the banks of the Potomac River, a place that officially did not exist. There, hidden microphones would record every word he spoke to his fellow prisoners, capturing conversations that would remain classified for over 50 years. And in those recordings, the same themes appeared again and again, spoken by generals and privates alike, by hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, and by teenage conscripts who had barely fired their rifles. They all said the same thing about fighting Americans. This is the story of what they said, why it mattered, and how their words, spoken in the belief that no one was listening, revealed the truth about the American way of war. The German Wehrmacht of World War II was widely considered one of the most formidable fighting forces in military history. From the lightning campaigns that conquered Poland in just 5 weeks during September of 1939 to the brutal years of combat on the Eastern Front, German soldiers had developed a fearsome reputation. Their tactics were studied in war colleges around the world. Their panzer divisions had rewritten the rules of armoured warfare during the stunning conquest of France in 1940. Man for man, German infantry were regarded by many military historians as superior to their opponents in training, discipline, and tactical flexibility. The Wehrmacht had defeated every army it had faced in the first 2 years of the war. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, German commanders initially viewed American forces with something approaching contempt. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent, and incapable of real sacrifice. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels depicted America as a nation of jazz musicians and Hollywood actors, corrupted by racial mixing and dominated by Jewish financiers. Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring famously dismissed American industrial capacity with the sneering comment that Americans only knew how to make razor blades. German officers who had spent years fighting the British and the Soviets assumed that the inexperienced Americans would prove far easier to defeat. This assumption appeared to be confirmed in February of 1943, when German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inflicted a devastating defeat on American troops at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. American units broke and ran. Officers lost control of their men. Equipment was abandoned in panicked retreats. The Germans captured thousands of prisoners and inflicted heavy casualties, killing or wounding over 6,000 American soldiers in just a few days. Rommel himself noted that the American forces had shown their inexperience, losing sight of the broader picture in the chaos of battle. In the aftermath, local North African nomads stripped dead bodies of boots, socks, and jackets, a grim scene that General Omar Bradley witnessed upon his arrival and never forgot. But something strange happened in the months and years that followed Kasserine Pass. The contempt that German soldiers initially felt toward Americans began to change. It did not transform into respect for American infantry tactics, which many Germans continued to criticize throughout the war. Instead, it transformed into something closer to dread. A specific kind of fear that had nothing to do with the skill of individual American riflemen and everything to do with what those riflemen could summon from the sky and from beyond the horizon. Something that no amount of German training or courage could overcome. To understand what German prisoners kept saying about Americans, we must first understand the secret programs that recorded their words. In the summer of 1942, the United States War Department established a top-secret facility on land that had once belonged to George Washington's River Farm, one of 5 farms that composed the Mount Vernon estate. The site was known only by its mailing address, P.O. Box 1142, Fort Hunt, Virginia. 87 buildings were constructed there, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. The facility's true purpose was hidden even from most of the military. Officers stationed there were forbidden from telling anyone, including their families, what they did. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. What happened at Fort Hunt would remain classified until the 1990s, and the full story did not emerge until the 2000s. Between mid-1942 and July of 1945, 3,451 prisoners passed through Fort Hunt. They included 15 Nazi generals, U-boat commanders who had terrorized Allied shipping in the Atlantic, rocket scientists who had built the V-2 missiles raining down on London, and intelligence officers who knew the secrets of German military operations. Each one was brought there for interrogation, but the interrogations themselves were only part of the operation. The real intelligence goldmine lay in what prisoners said to each other when they believed no one was listening. Every room at Fort Hunt was bugged. Microphones the size of watermelons were hidden in overhead light fixtures, behind walls, and inside furniture. Monitors worked around the clock in shifts inside a cramped concrete bunker outside the compound, wearing headphones and transcribing conversations in real time. German listeners fluent in the language captured every whispered confidence, every casual remark between cellmates. The operation produced over 5,000 intelligence reports during the war, including crucial information about German weapons programs, military installations, and troop dispositions. The interrogators were often Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany as children. Many had lost family members to the Holocaust. Granted emergency American citizenship at a nearby federal courthouse, they used their native German and cultural knowledge to build rapport with prisoners. They played chess with Nazi generals. They discussed philosophy with U-boat commanders. They offered coffee, cigarettes, and decent food. Henry Colm, who later became a physicist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, recalled at a reunion in 2007 that they got more information out of a German general with a game of chess or ping-pong than they do today with their torture. The approach was based on a simple insight. Prisoners who were treated with respect talked freely, especially when they did not know they were being recorded. When the war ended in August of 1945, Fort Hunt personnel received orders to destroy all records and artifacts within 24 hours. Men burned classified documents continuously, reducing mountains of intelligence material to ash. The secrecy held for decades. The British ran a parallel operation at Trent Park, a magnificent country estate north of London that had once belonged to Sir Philip Sassoon. There, 59 captured German generals and dozens of additional senior officers lived in relative luxury, complete with billiards, a library, table tennis, beer, and whiskey rations. The estate had manicured grounds where prisoners could walk and talk freely. The comfort was entirely deliberate. It was designed to make prisoners lower their guard and speak openly. Hidden microphones were everywhere. They were concealed in light fittings, fireplaces, plant pots, skirting boards, floorboards, and even inside trees in the garden. The billiard table was bugged. One prisoner confidently concluded that the British were too stupid to bug their conversations. He was entirely wrong. Over 1,300 transcripts were produced at Trent Park. In November of 2001, German historian Sonke Neitzel discovered approximately 150,000 pages of these secretly recorded conversations in declassified archives in Britain and the United States. What he found in those pages transformed our understanding of the German soldiers' experience. Among the revelations were candid discussions of atrocities on the Eastern Front, frank admissions of knowledge about the Holocaust, and honest assessments of morale and leadership on the German side. But woven throughout these conversations was a recurring theme, something that German soldiers of every rank mentioned when discussing combat against the Americans. They talked about the artillery. German prisoners in France frequently remarked on the heavy volume of American fire they had experienced. Even Germans who were critical of American infantry consistently praised the artillery. This was the finding documented by the Army Historical Foundation in their comparative study of American and German field artillery in World War II. German prisoners attested to the catastrophic effects of one American innovation in particular, a technique called time on target. Time on target was a method of coordinating fire from multiple artillery batteries so that all rounds struck the target simultaneously, arriving within a window of plus or minus 3 seconds. The mathematics required to achieve this were complex. Each battery had to calculate the exact time its shells would take to reach the target based on distance, elevation, weather conditions, barrel wear, and the specific characteristics of the ammunition and guns being used. Then all batteries would fire at precisely staggered intervals, so their shells arrived at the same moment. A battery farther from the target would fire first, a battery closer would fire later. When the calculations were done correctly, the shells converged on the target at the same instant. The effect on the receiving end was devastating beyond anything the Germans had experienced in years of combat. There was no warning, no ranging shots that gave defenders time to take cover. No opportunity to run for a foxhole or a cellar. One moment there was silence, perhaps broken only by the distant sound of engines or the murmur of conversation. The next moment, the world exploded in a simultaneous thunderclap of destruction. Men who had survived years of fighting on the Eastern Front described time-on-target barrages as the most terrifying experience of their military careers. A German veteran later described the single greatest fear among troops facing Americans on the Western Front. It was the crackle of an American walkie-talkie. This simple sound, the static and voices of American radio communication, meant that overwhelming artillery was about to rain death on German positions with inexhaustible and accurate shells. American forward observers could call in fire support within minutes. German soldiers learned to fear the sight of a lone American soldier with a radio far more than a squad of riflemen. The numbers tell the story of American artillery dominance. At the Battle of the Bulge near Dom-Butgenbach on December 22, 1944, American artillery from the 1st Infantry Division fired over 10,000 rounds in a single day to stop German armoured attacks. During the 9th Army Rhine crossing in March of 1945, 2,070 American guns opened the attack at a rate of 1,000 rounds per minute, expending over 65,000 shells in the initial bombardment alone. In the fighting for Hill 192 outside St. Lo in July of 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division fired up to 20 time-on-target concentrations per night against German positions. American artillery also possessed advantages in mobility and supply that the Germans could not match. Under favorable conditions, an American heavy artillery battalion could road march up to 160 miles in a single day. German artillery still relied heavily on horses for transport. American ammunition was standardized and mass-produced. German forces used captured artillery pieces from across Europe, including French, Czech, Polish, and Soviet guns, each requiring different ammunition that created chronic supply problems. When an American artillery battery ran low on shells, fresh supplies arrived within hours. German batteries often had to ration their fire, saving ammunition for emergencies that grew more frequent as the war continued. But the artillery alone does not explain what happened to German morale. Something else came from the sky. Something that made movement in daylight suicidal and confined German operations to the hours of darkness and bad weather. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox who had defeated the British in North Africa before American intervention, was among the first senior German commanders to articulate what fighting under Allied air superiority truly meant. Writing after the Battle of Alam Halfa in 1942, he made a stark observation about fighting without air cover. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, he wrote, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. Rommel was describing the helplessness of his own forces when denied air support, comparing their disadvantage to that of colonial subjects facing industrialized armies. This was not the observation of a defeated pessimist. It was the clinical assessment of one of Germany's most brilliant tactical commanders, a man who had outmaneuvered British forces repeatedly in the desert. Rommel understood that air power had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. Ground forces without air cover were blind and vulnerable, unable to move, resupply, or concentrate without being attacked from above. By June of 1944, 4 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, Rommel wrote to his wife Lucy with a more desperate tone. "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements," he told her. "There is simply no answer to it." His exchange with Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring at a conference in Germany about the North African situation became legendary among German officers. When Rommel complained about Allied air power, Göring dismissed his concerns, claiming that Americans only knew how to make razor blades. Rommel's reply was devastating. "We could do with some of those razor blades, Herr Reichsmarschall." German soldiers coined a term for the death that came from above. They called it Jabo Tod, death by fighter bomber. The word Jabo was short for Jagdbomber, the German term for the American and British aircraft that prowled the skies over France from dawn to dusk. These aircraft operated in a constant umbrella over the battlefield, attacking anything that moved on the roads below. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, horse-drawn wagons, motorcycles, even individual soldiers were targets for their bombs, rockets, and machine guns. The P-47 Thunderbolt was particularly feared. German pilots initially mocked its bulky appearance when it first appeared over Europe. The Thunderbolt was indeed massive, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, weighing over 8 tons fully loaded. But the mockery quickly turned to terror. The Thunderbolt's size meant it could carry an enormous payload of bombs and rockets while still being fast and maneuverable enough to dogfight with German interceptors. Its 850 caliber machine guns could shred anything on the ground. General Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters, wrote in his post-war memoir that from the very first moment of the invasion, the Allies had absolute air supremacy. Therefore, the enemy, our own troops, and the population asked the obvious question: where is the Luftwaffe? Lieutenant General Bodo Zimmermann, Chief Operations Officer of Army Group D in France, confirmed that the whole area through which German divisions had to march was being intensively patrolled by Allied air forces. No road movement by day was possible in view of this air umbrella. Field Marshal Hans-Günther von Kluge, after taking over Army Group B in Normandy from the wounded Rommel, wrote directly to Adolf Hitler with a stark assessment. In the face of total enemy air superiority, he wrote, "We can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield." This was an astonishing admission from a senior German commander, an acknowledgement that tactical skill was irrelevant against an enemy who owned the sky. Vice Admiral Friedrich Lengfeld, Rommel's naval aide who served with him throughout the Normandy campaign, offered a more analytical observation. "Utilization of the Anglo-American air forces," he wrote, "is the modern type of warfare, turning the flank not from the side but from above. The traditional concepts of maneuver, the envelopment and encirclement that had won Germany's victories in Poland and France, were meaningless when the enemy could attack from a third dimension that Germany could not contest." German forces planned all major movements around weather that would ground Allied aircraft. Operations were scheduled for periods of rain, fog, and overcast skies. Supply convoys moved only at night. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final major offensive in the West, launched in December of 1944, was deliberately timed to coincide with a forecast of overcast skies that would keep Allied aircraft on the ground. When the clouds cleared on December 23 and American fighter bombers filled the sky in overwhelming numbers, the offensive's fate was sealed within days. But artillery and air power were only part of what German prisoners talked about. There was something else, something that struck at the very heart of German military culture and the ideology that had sustained the Wehrmacht through years of war. The Germans had a word for it: Materialschlacht, the material battle. It described a war decided not by tactical brilliance, not by courage or discipline or superior training, but by industrial capacity, by the sheer weight of stuff: tanks, trucks, shells, bombs, fuel, food, uniforms, boots, everything that an army needs to fight. And it was psychologically devastating to an army that had been taught to believe in the superiority of German arms and the weakness of American civilization. A captured German soldier marched past Allied supply dumps in Normandy during the summer of 1944, reportedly told his captors that he now understood how Germany had been defeated. "You piled up the supplies," he said, "and then you let them fall on us." Rommel himself had recognized this dynamic early in the war, even before American entry. "The battle is fought and decided by the quartermasters," he wrote, long before the shooting begins. Wars were won not by the bravest soldiers but by the nations that could produce and transport the most material to the front lines. The scale of American logistics was beyond anything the Wehrmacht could match or even comprehend. Millions of tons of war material were shipped across the Atlantic to support operations in Europe. American soldiers received generous daily rations, while German rations steadily diminished as the war continued and resources grew scarce. By 1945, some German units were surviving on less than half the calories their American counterparts consumed. When a Sherman tank was destroyed, another appeared to replace it, often within days. When American artillery expended 10,000 shells in a single day, fresh ammunition arrived the next morning. When a fighter bomber was shot down, another rolled off assembly lines in Michigan or California to take its place. The ability to replace losses faster than Germans could inflict them eroded German fighting spirit more than any single battle. German soldiers came to understand that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire industrial civilization that could produce weapons and supplies in quantities that defied imagination. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, during the Normandy campaign. His division was fully equipped with the latest tanks and vehicles, and was considered one of the best-trained units in the German army. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy beachhead that would shatter German defences in France. The operation began with a massive carpet-bombing attack on German positions near St. Lo. Bayerlein was in the target zone when the bombs began to fall. Approximately 2,500 American aircraft dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs on an area just 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. The bombardment lasted for hours. Bayerlein's account, written for the United States Army Historical Division after the war as part of the Foreign Military Studies program, remains one of the most vivid descriptions of American firepower's effect on German soldiers. The long duration of the bombing, he wrote, without any possibility for opposition, created depression and a feeling of helplessness, weakness, and inferiority. Therefore, the morale attitude of a great number of men grew so bad that they, feeling the uselessness of fighting, surrendered, deserted to the enemy, or escaped to the rear. Bayerlein continued his description of the destruction. The well dug in infantry was smashed by the heavy bombs in their foxholes and dugouts, or killed and buried by blast. Tanks and guns were destroyed and overturned. The whole bombed area was transformed into fields covered with craters, in which no human being was alive. Equipment that survived the bombing was scattered and disoriented. Soldiers who emerged from cover were dazed and unable to function. The carefully prepared defensive positions that had held American forces at bay for weeks were obliterated in hours. Bayerlein had served in every major theatre of the war. He had fought in Poland during the Lightning Campaign of 1939. He had participated in the conquest of France in 1940. He had served in North Africa as Rommel's chief of staff, experiencing the desert warfare that made the Afrika Korps legendary. He had fought on the Eastern Front, where millions died in the largest and most brutal military conflict in human history. He had witnessed some of the most intense combat of the 20th century. Yet about Operation Cobra, he made a statement that captured the essence of what fighting Americans truly meant. "For me," he declared, who during this war was in every theatre committed at the points of the main effort, "this was the worst I ever saw." This was the worst he ever saw. Not Stalingrad, not El Alamein, not the tank battles on the Eastern Front where entire armies were destroyed. The carpet bombing at St. Lo. German assessments of American infantry themselves were more mixed than their unanimous fear of American firepower. Many German officers and soldiers held a low opinion of American tactical skills, especially early in the war. They observed that American soldiers bunched too closely together during battle, making them vulnerable to artillery and automatic weapons. They noted that Americans fired their weapons wildly without proper fire discipline. They criticized American camouflage and concealment as amateurish compared to German standards. Rather than closing with the enemy in traditional fire and maneuver tactics, Americans would identify a German position, call in massive artillery and airstrikes, wait until the position was pulverized, and then advance through the wreckage. Many German soldiers found this style of warfare frustrating. To them, it seemed as though Americans were avoiding direct combat, hiding behind their firepower rather than fighting man-to-man. General George Patton himself acknowledged this dynamic to a French colleague with characteristic bluntness. "The poorer the infantry," he said, "the more artillery it needs. And the American infantry needs all it can get." Yet the criticisms of American infantry came with significant caveats that revealed genuine respect. One German veteran described Americans as enthusiastic amateurs, with a disposition to aggression he had never seen in any other nation's sons. American soldiers did not skulk or retreat. They fought back immediately and ferociously. Americans would immediately return fire, the veteran observed. They would bring a punishing rain of artillery or air power on top of whatever they were fighting, and they would move to counterattack as soon as the rain of death ended. What Americans lacked in tactical refinement, this veteran concluded, they more than compensated for with sheer, unadulterated, unapologetic combat aggression. Rommel, who had inflicted the humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass that seemed to confirm Nazi propaganda about American weakness, later acknowledged how quickly Americans learned from their mistakes. In Tunisia, he wrote, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. Although we had to wait until the Patton Army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare, the same army that had broken and run at Kasserine Pass became, within 18 months, a force that shattered German defences across France, in a campaign that Rommel himself called astonishing. December of 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. More than 200,000 German soldiers and over 1,000 tanks attacked through the Ardennes forest, the same route Germany had used to bypass French defences in 1940. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive and witnessed both the initial German successes and the ultimate failure. He later gave credit to the stubborn defence of Saint-Vit for spoiling the German plan for the Battle of the Bulge. American forces held the critical road junction for 6 to 7 days against repeated attacks, throwing off the entire German timetable and allowing reinforcements to arrive. The town of Bastogne, held by the American 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, became another immovable obstacle. When German officers delivered an ultimatum demanding surrender on December 22, American General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single-word reply that has become legendary: nuts. The German officers had to ask what it meant. They were told it was the equivalent of go to hell. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt was a decorated paratroop commander who had fought at Crete during the German airborne invasion in 1941, in North Africa against the British, and in Normandy against the American landings. For the Ardennes offensive, he was given command of Germany's last airborne operation, a night combat jump behind American lines designated Operation Stosser. The mission was intended to seize key road junctions and create confusion in the American rear. His assessment of the mission was bleak from the start. Never in my entire career, he later wrote, had I been in command of a unit with less fighting spirit. The men assigned to him were a hodgepodge collection scraped together from replacement pools, many of them inexperienced boys or older men unfit for front-line service. Most had never made a parachute jump in their lives. The transport pilots were equally inexperienced in night navigation. When von der Heydt protested the inadequate resources he had been given for such a critical mission, Field Marshal Walter Model replied with brutal honesty. He gave the entire Ardennes offensive less than a 10% chance of succeeding, Model admitted. But it must be done, he said, because this offensive is the last chance to conclude the war favourably. Germany was rolling the dice with everything it had left, knowing the odds were terrible. The jump was a disaster. Scattered by high winds and inexperienced pilots who dropped their paratroopers miles from the intended targets, von der Heydt found himself with barely 300 men instead of the 800 to 1,200 he needed. Many had been injured on landing. Their heavy weapons and radios were lost. Unable to accomplish his mission of seizing the crossroads, he could only watch from hiding as American reinforcements poured past his position toward the front. Recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, von der Heydt released captured American prisoners and sent them with his wounded to seek medical care from Allied forces. He himself surrendered on December 23, 1944, wounded and suffering from frostbite, walking into an American position rather than freezing to death in the forest. On the German side of the lines, men continued to fight through the bitter winter, but the conversations recorded at Fort Hunt and Trent Park revealed a growing despair among German officers and soldiers, a recognition that the war was lost not because German soldiers had failed, but because they had been overwhelmed by a system of warfare they could not match. The Americans could absorb German attacks, replace their losses, and keep coming. Germany could not. The introduction of the VT proximity fuse during the Battle of the Bulge marked another turning point in the struggle. These shells contained tiny radar sets that detected when they were near a target and detonated automatically in mid-air, spraying shrapnel downward. The effect was to eliminate the protection of foxholes. Soldiers who had survived years of combat by digging deep and waiting out bombardments found themselves killed by shells that exploded 10 feet above their heads. General George Patton wrote to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Army Ordnance, with evident satisfaction about the new weapon. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," he reported. "We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. German prisoners described VT fuse attacks as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense." The war in Europe entered its final months in early 1945. German soldiers facing the Red Army in the east fought with desperate ferocity, knowing what awaited them in Soviet captivity. Stories of forced labor, starvation, brutality, and execution filtered back to German lines. According to West German government investigations conducted after the war, over 1 million German prisoners died in Soviet custody, though Soviet records claim a much lower figure. But those facing the Western Allies increasingly surrendered without heavy resistance. The reason was simple and pragmatic. German soldiers wanted to be captured by Americans. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of prisoners was stark and well known to German forces by the final year of the war. American captivity offered something the Soviets did not: a reasonable chance of survival and eventual return home. Günter Graue was captured in 1944 and transported across the Atlantic to Fort Lewis in the state of Washington. At age 91, decades after the war ended, he returned to Fort Lewis specifically to say thank you. He recalled standing in front of a shop in the prisoner of war camp, trying to decide whether to buy ice cream or Coca-Cola first. The last ice cream he had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, when such luxuries were still available before rationing and shortages made them impossible to find. Coca-Cola he had never tasted in his life. He decided to take both. Hans Waker, held at Fort Robinson in the state of Nebraska, recalled that their treatment was excellent, the food was excellent, and the clothing adequate. Upon arriving in America, German prisoners were amazed by the comfort of the Pullman railroad cars that carried them to their prison camps, by the country's vast size and undamaged cities, and by its prosperity that seemed untouched by war. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. What they found was a nation of abundance that seemed capable of producing unlimited quantities of everything, from food to clothing to the weapons that had defeated them. The secretly recorded conversations captured more than just assessments of American firepower and logistics. They captured moments of reflection and self-examination that challenged the entire Nazi worldview. General Dietrich von Koltitz, the military governor of Paris, who had refused Hitler's direct order to destroy the city before the Allied liberation in August of 1944, was recorded at Trent Park in October of that year. His words were devastating in their honesty. "We all share the guilt," he said. "We went along with everything, and we half took the Nazis seriously instead of saying to hell with you and your stupid nonsense. I misled my soldiers into believing this rubbish. I feel utterly ashamed of myself." The Hurtgen Forest campaign in the autumn and winter of 1944 produced one of the war's most remarkable stories of enemy respect and shared humanity. Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld of the 275th Infantry Division commanded a company in a heavily mined defensive area on November 12, 1944. When an American soldier was wounded by a mine in the forest between the lines, his screams for help echoed across the battlefield for hours. Lengfeld first ordered his men not to fire on American medics who attempted to reach the wounded man. The rescue attempts failed, beaten back by the minefields that made movement impossible. When no successful rescue came after hours of listening to the Americans' cries for help, Lengfeld made an extraordinary decision. He would lead his own medics into the minefield under the protection of the Red Cross flag to save his enemy. He stepped on a mine and was mortally wounded in the attempt. American veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment learned of Lengfeld's sacrifice and were profoundly moved. On October 7, 1994, they placed a memorial at the Hurtgen War Cemetery. It reads, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." It is the only known monument placed by American soldiers in a German war cemetery to honor a German officer. The war ended in May of 1945. Over 370,000 German prisoners were held in camps across the United States by the time of surrender. Most were repatriated to Germany by 1946, after helping with agricultural work and reconstruction projects that showed them more of America's wealth and generosity. They returned to a Germany in ruins, their cities bombed flat, their families scattered or dead, their nation divided between occupation zones that would soon become separate countries. But they carried with them memories of the enemy they had fought, and those memories shaped how they told the story of the war to their children and grandchildren. The picture that emerged was complex. Americans were not the best soldiers they had faced in terms of individual tactical skill, but Americans represented something more terrifying: the limitless resources of an industrial democracy that could replace every loss and absorb every blow without weakening. German veterans, who had fought on multiple fronts, drew sharp distinctions between their opponents. The British were seen as competent and professional but cautious, tending to attack only with absolutely overwhelming force and stopping to consolidate gains rather than pursuing exploitation. The Soviets were recognized for extraordinary endurance and ferocity, their willingness to suffer casualties on a scale that would have broken any Western army. But Americans occupied a unique space in the German imagination. They were the opponents German soldiers most wanted to surrender to, and simultaneously the ones whose firepower they feared most. The scholarship on German prisoner testimonies has expanded significantly in recent decades, as archives have been declassified, and historians have gained access to materials that were hidden for generations. Sonke Neitzel's discovery of the secretly recorded conversations in 2001 led to two landmark books. Tapping Hitler's Generals, published in 2007, presented transcripts from Trent Park with analysis of what they revealed about German military thinking. Soldaten, published in 2012, and co-authored with social psychologist Harold Welzer, analyzed conversations from both British and American archives to understand how ordinary German soldiers thought about violence, atrocity, and their own actions. Rick Atkinson's Pulitzer Prize-winning Liberation trilogy extensively incorporates German perspectives alongside American sources, documenting how the United States Army evolved from its stumbling and humiliating debuts in North Africa to a seasoned and professional force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht in sustained combat. Stephen Ambrose, through more than 600 personal interviews, including German veterans like Colonel Hans von Luck, created influential works that captured testimony from both sides of the battlefield. Hans von Luck served as a colonel in the 21st Panzer Division. He had fought at El Alamein and Kasserine Pass before finding himself paralyzed on D-Day by the absurdity of the German command structure. His division was positioned to counterattack the British landings on the eastern beaches, but the Panzer reserves could not be released without Hitler's personal approval, and Hitler was sleeping. No one dared wake the Führer to tell him that the invasion of Europe had begun. Von Luck's memoir, Panzer Commander, published in 1989 with an introduction by Stephen Ambrose, offers one of the most reflective German accounts of the war. In 2006, National Park Service Cultural Resources Specialist Brandon Byes launched an oral history project at Fort Hunt that eventually captured testimony from around 70 surviving veterans of the interrogation program before most of them passed away. The 2007 Washington Post article by Petula Dvorak titled "Fort Hunt's Quiet Men Break Silence on WW2" brought the story to public attention for the first time, 6 decades after the facility closed. What emerges from all these sources, from the secretly recorded conversations and the post-war memoirs and the oral histories and the statistical analyses, is a consistent picture. German soldiers believed themselves tactically superior to Americans, and by some measures they may have been right. Military historian Colonel Trevor Dupuy analyzed combat data and found that German ground forces generally inflicted casualties at higher rates than they suffered when fighting American and British troops under comparable circumstances. Man for man, the German infantry may indeed have been more skilled, but this superiority was rendered irrelevant by the 3 factors German prisoners cited most consistently in their recorded conversations and post-war testimonies. Artillery that could be called down with a walkie-talkie, arriving with devastating accuracy within minutes of a request. Fighter bombers that made daylight movement suicidal and confined all German operations to darkness and bad weather. A logistics system that replaced every destroyed Sherman with 2 more, every expended shell with a fresh supply, every fallen soldier with another volunteer from the vast American population. The American way of war was not about individual soldier quality. It was about systemic, industrial-scale lethality. Germans who mocked American infantry discipline in the same breath acknowledged that this material battle, this material Schlacht, was unwinnable. Military historian Max Hastings addressed this paradox directly in his book, Armageddon, published in 2004. He argued that Hitler's army was, as a fighting force, better than the American and British armies by traditional measures of tactical skill and small unit performance. But he added a crucial caveat that reframed the entire question. If the Americans and British had been as good soldiers as the Waffen-SS, as suicidally brave as some men of the Red Army, they would have needed to be people like them, imbued with their ethos of tyranny and savagery. Democratic armies, Hastings suggested, paid a high price for preserving the inhibitions and decencies of democratic citizens at war. American soldiers were not fanatical killers willing to die for an ideology. They were citizens in uniform who wanted to win the war, go home, and resume their lives. They used firepower instead of human lives wherever possible, not because they were cowards, but because they valued human life, including their own. But they also retained something the Wehrmacht had lost in its years of atrocity and ideological corruption. The recordings at Fort Hunt and Trent Park captured German officers discussing not just American firepower but the moral dimension of the war itself. They talked about atrocities they had witnessed or participated in on the Eastern Front. They talked about the Holocaust, sometimes with horror, sometimes with chilling indifference. They talked about the growing realization that they had served a regime of unprecedented evil, that the cause they had fought for deserved to be defeated. Perhaps this is the final lesson of what German prisoners said about fighting Americans. They spoke of artillery and air power and material abundance because these were the immediate, visceral realities of combat that had burned themselves into memory. But behind those observations lay a deeper recognition that took longer to articulate. They had fought for a cause that deserved to lose. And they had been defeated by a nation that, for all its tactical shortcomings and inexperienced soldiers, represented something they had helped destroy in their own country. Democracy, the rule of law, human dignity. The last survivors of World War II are passing from the stage of history. The Fort Hunt veterans who gathered for reunions in the 2000s are nearly all gone now. The German prisoners who marveled at ice cream and Coca-Cola in American camps have followed them. The transcripts remain in archives, 150,000 pages of voices from a vanished world, speaking truths they never intended anyone to hear. When researchers study those pages today, they find the same themes recurring across thousands of conversations. The thunder of American artillery, the shadows of fighter bombers crossing the sun, the endless columns of trucks bringing supplies that seemed to multiply no matter how many were destroyed. The sergeant who stumbled out of the Belgian woods in December of 1944 with his hands raised, the one who muttered something about the shells and the sky, he was eventually transported to a camp somewhere in the United States. The records do not tell us his name or what became of him after the war. But we know what he said, because thousands of his comrades said the same thing. They said the Americans fought with machines, not men. They said the walkie-talkie was the deadliest weapon in the American arsenal. They said that no amount of German courage could overcome the weight of American steel. And when they were captured, fed, and housed in clean barracks an ocean away from the destruction they had witnessed, many of them wondered how they had ever believed the propaganda that told them America was weak. Fighting Americans meant fighting a system, not just an army. It meant facing firepower that could be summoned in minutes and sustained for hours. It meant watching supplies flow in quantities that defied imagination. It meant learning, slowly and painfully, that tactical skill and personal courage were not enough when the enemy could bury you in steel and explosives without ever seeing your face. This was the American way of war, and every German prisoner, whether he admired it or despised it, whether he survived to tell his story or perished in a nameless field, knew exactly what it meant. It meant that the war could only end one way.